I'd like to thank the Foundation Sommer for having organized this very interesting event. As you might have noted, it's been a while since I spoke French last, and that was about 30 years ago. I was told to speed it up a bit.
We'll be here another hour on top. Before we get to the last session, I'm quite serious about that we have to make up some time. I have to catch my flight back home tonight, but more importantly, Jurgen has to leave on time. He told me twice. He has to get his train on time because his daughter is marrying tomorrow. So you don't want him to miss the wedding of his daughter. It would be a crisis between our organizations, and we've spent a lot of time building a good relationship. So let's not risk it on that. So we'll shorten the last session a little bit. The way we will do it is I'll give you a few introductory remarks, and then we'll have four statements, I should say, starting with Diarmaid O'Quanachain. I hope I got that right. That's an Irish name, and they're notoriously difficult for me. He should be with us online. I don't know if he is. I'm being told that's the case. So Diarmaid will kick it off. Then we'll move to Guillaume Sainteny, who'll give us. No, I'm sorry. We'll move to Gilles Martin. Who is the spiritual father, if I may say so, of REs in France. He'll give us his personal account of his voyage and how he developed that concept and made it the success that it's already showing to be today. We'll then move to Guillaume Sainteny, who will also present his work on the incentivization of land conservation or nature conservation on private land more broadly, and then specifically on the question of how that could play out for REs. And then Jurgen will finish off this session by sharing his perspectives as the Secretary General of the European Landowners Organization. So he'll give us his view of landowners across Europe. But before we get started, I would like to zoom out a little bit, because the first part of the day has been very technical, very detailed. I've never been to such a passionate discussion of legal details and practical details of conservation instruments, if I may say so. So I'm very impressed by this energy. I congratulate you for your stamina. You're still here. And so I think at this time, now that we're coming closer to the end of the event, it's good to step back a little bit and ask ourselves, why is this actually relevant? Why are we engaging at this time on such a particular subject? From my perspective, as the president of Eurocide, which is an umbrella organization of nature conservation organizations across Europe, we are witnessing a time of political and social volatility, polarization. I watched Macron's speech this week on television, at least parts of it, not all of it, and where he said Europe is not immortal, I think. That was his words, or something like that. Not invincible. Yeah? Okay. Huh? Immortal. Right. That's so. And what I understood, what he meant, is the idea of Europe as well. And what I associate with this is a core idea of civil dialogue that we have. And I mean that in every sense of the word. So a word. It's about individual liberty versus social obligations, right? And they're both connected to private property, these questions. So for me, the whole discussion about REs is like a crystallization of that civil dialogue about the tension between individual liberties connected to private properties and the social obligations that we can expect from landowners to also respect. And I don't know who said it. He doesn't like the word obligation in the term. Yeah, someone said it. I think you were. I share that sentiment. I very much like the word easement in English. It has something as easy. You know, you're easing into something. Sounds much better to me than obligation. So for me, again, OREs are a perfect example of that dialogue, of that tension. And in order for this dialogue to be productive, I think we need 4 essential components. We need the political context that gives us a direction of what is our common objective with regard to the climate and biodiversity crisis. We have that on the European level with the European Green Deal and the biodiversity strategy. We also need a legal framework, obviously, and we've talked about that today at length. We'll hear more about it from Mr. Martin. So we know we have a legal security of what are the roles, the responsibilities, and also what are the sanctions for not obeying by the terms of our agreements. We also need incentives. We've talked about that as well, and we'll hear more about it. And we need those incentives for all sides who are part of this conversation. So landowners, the public, and those representing the public, be it public authorities or non-governmental NGOs. Otherwise, they won't negotiate, and negotiations can be cumbersome, as you know, and they take time. Otherwise, no one will engage in those. And last but not least, we need also a culture of trust and cooperation. And I think we are trying, this event is a part of building that kind of culture of cooperation. That's why I find ORE so important, and I think Jurgen will agree with me on that and will say something about the role that networks can play on, in this dimension, and partnerships like our organizations have. So for me, the question of upscaling OREs that we'll tackle now is not just about populating the database for 30 by 30, that's important too, or for filling binders with paper. So it's about finding that concrete expression of a very fundamental concept of how to deal with one another in society and how to reach these joint objectives. With that, I'll leave my introductory remarks a bit philosophical maybe, but it's something that I perceived as. With that, we'll move on. Without further ado, I'll take questions after the 4 presentations in the spirit of making up some time to Gilles Martin, who will present in French, and I'll be your assistant forwarding the slides if all goes well. Over to you, Gilles.
Thank you.
I'm going to start. Since I'm often presented as the father of the real environmental obligation, so it's the image of paternity and decency has come to me to illustrate my speech. So the first pictures that are going to appear, I'm going to say a word about the name that was chosen, obligation. And speaking to our Belgian friend who doesn't like the word obligation, but in fact, it's just a legal thing. It doesn't mean it's obligatory. On the contrary, it's only voluntary, where you only join if you want to join, which means that once you're in, then there are commitments that you've taken, and they do become an obligation at that point. But they're the obligations that we've accepted and not obligations that are imposed from the outside world. It's important to make that distinction. So engagement first, obligation after, and not obligation as though it's a constraint to obey the law or something. So the idea and the image of the birth here, and the birth was difficult. because it took 20 years of gestation, which is a lot. Here are the steps, and I forgot one step. In fact, it's in 1994, in fact, that for the first time we spoke about the idea of a contractual servitudes or easements that would have to do with the contractual constraint, which we spoke about in our discussions. But we spoke about it, we didn't go further. But in 27, Mrs. Gilles handed over a report about conventional protection of natural spaces under French law and compared. I said compared because you can see that this was reviewed by the external world as the ideas being developed. But she didn't go further in speaking about that possibility. In 2004, the French Company for the Rights of the Environment received an order for a report on this topic, and since I was a member of the French Society, I was given the responsibility of that report. So I handed it over in 2004, and it was submitted and it's died a great death in the bottom of a drawer. And one asked me to produce a report in 2008. I said that I had done one 4 years earlier, and it wasn't the same authority. So they said, could you start over again? So I sent him a report in 2008 that went a bit further. It was with a view to the Grenelle, the Environment Grenelle, in 2010. Now this time, there was a presentation of the report during the operational committee. Then it was covered by a senator who considered that it was a good idea and it should have gone further. But an agricultural syndicate spoke to the minister's cabinet and was opposed to our discussing this question further. So ORE was exiting for the second time. In 2013, I was asked if I didn't want to produce a report. And I think comedy is really due to repetition, but I will not be doing any more reports. But I'm going to do a law with a well-reasoned proposal for a law, and this law would be on biodiversity in 2016. So between 1997 and 2016, it's almost 20 years of gestation. Now, inspiration was found in comparative law, first in the US, but also the Canadian experience for the 4 provinces where you don't find Quebec, for those provinces that put into force the conservation management. And you have Australia, New Zealand, Scotland, and Chile, and Switzerland, to show that this is not a tool that's only for common law legislation. In this tool, you find it in legislations that are in civil law, Roman or Germanic law, to keep it short. So this example of the USA, 140,000 contracts covering some 10 million hectares. But those figures go back, and they've developed since then even further. So, this is a tool that, when it was adopted, encountered radical opposition. Some people have changed, others haven't, but some have changed. And there's some hesitations and sort of timid support. Radical opposition, I have to correct. No, I did correct it. Radical opposition on the part of some farming organizations, and the majority organizations, who are radically opposed to this tool at the time. Now, one of the directors told me 2 years ago that they had decided to no longer speak about OREs, even to say bad things about them. Just don't talk about OREs and stop them from existing, and so just ignore it. And then, as opponents, they had forest owners and hunters. So it was the last two groups that I mentioned that moved the most clearly forward, because little by little they were able to measure the interests of the OER, and they've changed a great deal. And today we find, in fact, including in farming areas, that are signing RNEs. And today we have the federal hunting license, and there are forest goers. I wanted to speak about hesitations and timid onboarding. I want to sweep in front of my front door. You get the law professors, such as myself, who consider that this tool is calling into question the servitude of conservation from Napoleon's time. And I think we need to think about it a few times before we touch that Napoleon Code of 1804. And it was likely to call into question the status of farmage. So that was a source of concern. So this is really the revolution. My main argument was maybe we could look at the future rather than looking at 89, and to try to move forward. So when say we're not at the beginning, is an owner can no really have other interests than egotistical or interests. What about the general interest? That is the government and us, right? NGOs. And we would have to fight for that, because it could be private owners that had other motives. And then political figures, in the broad sense of the term, were saying, is this not an instrument that's going to stop us from taking the decisions we want to take? For example, whenever we have a local urban plan, when somebody's going to be expropriated, or preemptive, are we not going to stop? If you have the response to that concern is nationalization of the land. And that's what happened in some areas, and with a very poor result. So we need to make progress.
Et les originalités, et je vais aller très vite, d'abord par rapport au droit français traditionnel et puis par rapport aux expériences étrangères, mais en commençant par souligner, next slide please, souligner les atouts majeurs de l'obligation réelle environnementale dans mon esprit. Eh bien, les atouts majeurs, on les a soulignés depuis ce matin, et je n'entre pas dans la technique puisque ça a été évoqué ce matin, mais c'est la liberté contractuelle pour définir le périmètre, pour définir la durée, pour définir le contenu des obligations. C'est un outil qui est offert aux parties.
Is a tool that was offered to all the various signatories of the convention, so that they can finish or complete their desire and actually put it into some sort of legal form. Now, finally, of course, there's that certain flexibility in order to adapt to the needs in the field and according to the desire of the landowner. That's very important because, as we said, you have easements on very small surfaces. Maybe it would be a little wooden shed that is a shelter for certain mice, and then sometimes it could cover several hundreds of hectares. And to perform and do all these beautiful projects that you were talking about this morning. Now, certain other distinctive features. Let's talk about French law to begin with. This ORE completely changes over the traditional French law concerning easements. That's very true. And through the Canadian example, we saw it was Quebec, of course. It was extremely important to shake up these old rights of easement, because it doesn't really create a sort of law between the lands, but also those partners who are part of a contract. There is a commitment from a landowner who gives a certain status, as you said, to the land, and that will enable this status to be to run with the land, as it were. And so this engagement is taken with a public authority or whatever it is, or some kind of institution, etc., in charge of environment. So this law removes this restriction about land or domains that belong to the neighbor, etc., etc. Besides, it's a sort of extension, because the landlord now has certain active obligations that they don't really have to go through, whereas with the normal sort of easements just tell you what you're not supposed to do, you know. And lastly, now, given these very different experiences that you have in foreign countries, is this lack of involvement and help from the state, particularly when it comes to tax incentives. When I say that there's an absence of state involvement, obviously the aim was to have some sort of instrument that would be offered to private landowners to implement this easement, conservation easement. But personally, I'm really disappointed that the government and the entire government system has never committed itself to this entire system, you know. There could be political backup. Now, if you ever hear a Secretary of State speak openly about easement, it would be in a very, very general context. I'm talking of conservation easement, and I'm sure you've heard, members of the EFB, exactly what an ORE is. But the French Office of Biodiversity, which is one of the most powerful tools that should have been used by us, did not do it and is not doing it, whereas these are the organizations to which most of the national parks report to, and the ORE in France would be a fantastic way of actually bringing in more and more national parks that would be part of biodiversity. No national park in France has asked for a signing of this kind of ORE, and it is indeed such a pity. That's what I mean when there's no backup from the government. In Australia, we know what's happening. We see what's happening in Quebec and also in the USA. Now, quite obviously, the main incentive would be a tax incentive. But I'm sure Guillaume would be better placed than I am to talk about that. Thank you so much.
Just need a moment to start your presentation, and here we go.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, je vais aller assez vite parce que je crois qu'on est un peu pris par le temps.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to do this very quickly because we're running short of time. You heard about a lot of these this morning. You talked about the more difficult part, which was the tax part of it. So how are we going to use this tax instrument in the eyes of what was done abroad, and what can we expect from France? And now go on to the second slide. Now, what are the tax incentives in English-speaking countries? What's important to understand is that in other countries, we have this idea of donation concerning easement. So right is considered in general as opposed to France rights. And these easements are for life. So someone accepts an easement on his property is no longer in possession of some of the rights that go with it. So by giving away part of these rights, he gives away part of his property rights. It could be different concerning rights to hunting, etc., etc. And all this costs. It all has a value. So the system determines exactly what this sort of donation is for this easement. So that is the cost of the value before and after the easement, and that's what gives you the final answer. Of course, there are exceptions. Please. Now, here are a few examples of certain countries. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the initial countries who had started this. Now, the taxes used are very different. There is income tax also, but you also have mutation rights, which are for free. You have some exemption of paying tax on capital gains, and then there are certain others in South Africa which are quite specific. You can deduct 4% from your total income multiplied by 25%, so that means 100% can be exempt. And for Australia, I think we had an Australian and Canadian listening in, and I hope I'm saying this right, but I believe you can deduct the value of this donation from your tax returns. In Canada, as you'll see, it is 29% of the total value. In the USA, it's roughly 200,000 conservation easements over 13 million hectares, so that's a huge. And you have 50% of this donation which can be deducted, but 100% is really to help farmers. If 50% actually comes from agriculture of their income, plus there is you get other ideas, other advantages, for instance, like the rights to mutation, which are reduced, and the values, of course, are calculated on the conservation easement. So that's quite a lot, and that is as far as the private parties are concerned. Now, for the companies, you have certain specific rules. Here we are looking at corporate taxes and also capital gains. So the sums here are quite high. It's either a total exemption of capital gains or it is a deduction of corporate taxes, which could be the entire amount of the donation, the value of the entire amount. Now, apart from these conservation easements, I would like to talk to you about two very special easements because they're very similar to our French system. The Williamson Act, I've taken the example of California, and there are other states also in which it exists. It's fairly different as compared to what we have in France. It's very old. It goes back to the 1960s. So it means you restrict the farming of areas in certain you delay it, and that's because it might be buildable or constructible, and so that means the person who holds it, he has to urbanize because there'll be a tax value which would be much higher than the return on the land. The idea here is that thanks to a contract with the local county where the owner commits himself to not urbanize, the land remains evaluated for land taxes according to its real agricultural use and not according to market value. So which is a real incentive. And in cases like this is not about for life, it's not perpetuity. So that means the state of California accepts certain tax expenses with a view to delaying urbanization so that the land remains for use of agriculture and also for recreational purposes, but which would not be for life. The other one is the open space impact, open space easement. This is another version, once again, in California, and it exists in other countries too. So the idea here is very close to sustainable development. You have these open spaces, and there's use and development allowed which would be in line with the features of this asset. So there is a tax incentive. If it's for life, then you can deduct the total amount of the donation from your tax returns, and if it is not, then it is assessed according to TF and its real use. So here the owner and the user, often very much the same person, can carry on with what they're doing, which is farming, as long as it doesn't spoil the picturesque value. And often it is for landscaping, and they talk about scenic value. That should not be degraded. So this is quite useful. That means you can carry on doing your economic activity as long as it doesn't touch the fundamental features of this land. Now, this was at a federal level. Now, let me tell you about what happens in the states, because you have an advantage, a fiscal advantage, and some counties have also done things according to their own local tax system. So it could either be a tax credit or it could be an exemption of land taxes. The total amounts are quite high. In Florida, it could be 100%, particularly for exemption of in Iowa and Puerto Rico, it could be 50% off on tax credits from your income tax, and in certain states it could be a postponement or a deferment. For instance, in Virginia, who have an annual budget meant where you earmark it, and it could be several $1 million. Similarly, for private companies or firms, generally it's a tax credit for corporate taxes, and here the amounts are also quite high, and also the possibility of deduction, which is also quite high, plus the transferability. I'll explain what transferability is in a minute. Now, is there any impact of this tax provision? Let me give you some examples. Firstly, in this case, you have a system of conservation easement without tax incentive. Here in Virginia, up to 89, there was no such tax incentive, so it was about 50 per year. And the minute you had this incentive, it came to 250 or 200, so that means it went up fourfold in the number of easements and also in the amount of surface covered. So the impact is quite huge. So when you already have a tax incentive and you increase the amount, it goes up considerably with the ceilings that you have. This is North Carolina. And this is also very difficult for us French people to understand, since it's not our culture, but in certain cases the tax credit that are associated with these easements are transferable, because very often these are land assets or farming land which have received income and which cannot take full advantage of tax opportunities. So over a certain period of time, you can actually sell your tax credit that's transferable. So a lot of people earn a lot of money in the USA, for instance, like in Hollywood, producers, actors, etc. They have tax deductions by buying these tax credits from farm owners who don't have enough income, and thanks to this tax credit that they sell, they make a little money, and it drains off money that comes from elsewhere. So when you allow transferability, you see an increase of conservation easements and the surface that's covered by this. Briefly about the costs. There were several surveys, and I'll just mention one. For instance, in South Africa, survey was done by Biofin, which say that it's about 31 euros a hectare, and this is of course much lower than purchase and state management, which would mean acquisition by the state, and then the cost of management, which could be 4 to 17 times cheaper than management by the state. Where does the money come from? That's, of course, extremely important. So in the different states, decentralized states, find a system that suits its best. Now, some provisions were voted in. You have certain state bonds in some cases. You've also got deed recording fees. In other cases, you have a tax on sale of sports articles. You have income that comes from lottery sales, etc. And then corporate taxes. I'm showing this to you because we did have some problems recently with ecological taxation, but the USA, where we find that people are, shy of paying taxes, they often vote during in local referendums for systems to have an increase in taxes as long as these taxes are based on the system. Now, in Georgia, you had 83% approval in the course of a referendum, and there were several other examples also. For instance, in New Jersey, you had 65% of the people who voted that part of the corporate taxes should be used for the improvement of local habitat and natural areas. In Tennessee, for instance, there were mutation rights which were also exempted, which is a huge amount normally, and this was set aside just for this. In some cases, the voters actually go in favor of an increase in taxes just to save this. Now, the French case. Let me distinguish because this is the whole issue. Should we or shouldn't we have a tax incentive? Now you have a certain what we call continuity easement conventions, conservation easements. There are certain French public institutions which don't really go for the national parks, who don't sign up these easements. Now, this would be what we have is a perfect tool to have a transition area where you have the heart of it, which is totally protected, and all the periphery, which is really not like that. So national parks should try and sign up these conservation easements in the periphery of the park, but they don't do it. And then the coastline, which is very beautifully covered, but the minute you're out of the so-called coastal area, you have a huge amount of urbanization. And here, too, one could have some useful easements signed. And then, of course, you have our communes. You have communes which have a lot of natural habitat, bogs and ponds and marshy lands, etc., and there's absolutely no easement. And then there are the green belts and the blue belts. Again, nothing is done over there. And then you've also got the sensitive areas, and those are areas where you could have conservation easements because they have a tax that is deducted for them, especially if they were to do it. And I don't know of any French département as such that were doing it. I think this should be mentioned in the SRADET because we are now revising the SRADETs, and once we revise them, once we're done with that, we will find that none of them has really thought about these OREs in France. I mean, nothing stopping them from doing it. This is a document concerning regional harmonization. It's a regional blueprint, There are different names for it. So it's a master plan for the development of a certain area. That's the SRADET, and it and he's mentioning other short forms for it. So this is the right to urbanization, and it's of course very important. Now, there are what I call subsidized OREs, and I'm not talking about the compensation ones because that's just a secondary one. No, we don't really require any kind of aid for that. Now, water agencies, some of them have all sorts of tools. Like one of them, Brummers has one, and Mediterranean and Corsica also. I believe Normandy has one as well. But in the Haute-Garonne, other areas of France, and in Brittany, that's not the case. I don't know why, because water agencies feel that it would be an excellent tool, and the director of the Ramos agency said that it's the best tool where it comes to cost efficiency for protecting all the water inlet areas. Now, concerning the coastal areas conservatories, I was quite surprised about that. Now, the easements were created partly to save them, and since 1995, the National Auditing Board decided not to audit this. They just felt that no one was going to acquire land over there, and so at the time we didn't really have these OREs, and once the OREs were created, then the local national audit said that we still don't have any kind of active policy concerning OREs, and I think that's a major problem today, because given the way we've moved on, I don't think there's going to be much progress when it comes to biodiversity budget in the coming years. So today we just have to use the tools which are the cheapest. The last slide, and here I'd like to remind you about the law. There are two very important points here. Article 72 says that communes can be exempted of land taxes for those lands which have drawn up conservation easement. Apart from that, there are all the registration fees which have been deducted or reduced, and Article number 73 is very important, as Gilles Martin told us. I'm not going to read it all back to you, but firstly, this report was deposited nearly 2 years later, submitted nearly 2 years later, which is not really very a big problem. But the report said there's not much we can do about it. Now, Gilles, you can tell me because you're more of a legal expert than I am, but I don't think this is legal according to the article here, because over here it says that the government is supposed to submit a report concerning the attractiveness of the tax incentives. So the government is supposed to do it. And how do we improve this attractiveness with the legal or tax incentives? If they say that you can't do anything about it, it's not answering the question. So parliamentarians should raise this question with the government and ask them, so when would we get a receipt that would be in line with this article, in compliance with this article? Then which should be the right mechanism? And there are quite a few people who feel that that tax exemption on land should be a must. I don't fully agree with them there, because that would mean there has to be a compensation, because if it's an obligation, then there must be compensation. If it is just left optional, there's no obligation, and that's why it was decided in 2016 to make it optional. Besides, communes are rather reticent about it, because they've already had a precedent where you had 100% exemption, and then there was a cap put on the amount of exemption. And we have an example. Natura 2000, for instance, received a lot of advantages, and finally they got scolded, and so on and so forth. I personally feel that one should let the communes decide whether there should be an exemption or not, and it should be based on a national tax. So what sort of tax? I don't think it should be free mutation rights, because you already have reduced rates for woodlands as long as you have a proper management plan, and also farming, especially if you've got good long-term revenues, etc. But I think it should be income tax and also on social contributions, knowing that it won't solve the problem with those lands which have no income. Some of them are non-constructed, have no revenue, and so they have a negative productivity, because they have to pay on the non-constructed areas, a tax on that. Anyway, you can't solve all the problems together, and it should be at a cost which is acceptable for the state. A very simple case, for instance, agricultural land. Now, fermage servitude is 150 euros per hectare or something like that. And then there's 30 euros concerning non-constructed taxation. So, for instance, if you are paying 30 or 40% tax, it's about 40 euros to the hectare. which isn't very high, and the loss of the states is also very low because these fermage rights or whatever, or servitudes, are very low in France. So I suggest that this is what one should be done, knowing that now budgets are getting quite tight at a national level. However, since now we have to stop creating all these expensive organizations to manage all these areas, perhaps we could strike a deal with the government, help us to have protective measures which would be less expensive, for example, like the ELO partners, because that's a lot of heavy machinery, and thanks to all that, through tax advantages, we would use less expensive measures, and so budgets for biodiversity will not be too high, and that's exactly what we are looking for at the national level. I'm sorry, it was a bit too long and a bit too technical.
I resist the temptation to enter into a discussion right away, but rather hand over to Jurgen directly, who now has it in his hands of whether he'll be with his wedding daughter tomorrow or not. The floor is all yours, Jurgen.
Well, thanks. You mentioned that the idea was to finalize a little bit about trust, which was your final element you needed. And in a certain way, we are ending in the way that we started the meeting with the very first question we got this morning, which was towards the Fondation François Sommer, but the question could have come to the European Landowners Organization, representing 2.8 million members, farmers, foresters, private individuals doing nature conservation, but also people living in rural places, is why the hell are you cooperating with nature organizations, what we call green and dark green organizations, who in reality want to buy our land, they want to stop the hunting. Why are you doing that? Now, let's say the good news is that Tilmann is getting the same questions if he's speaking with nature conservation organizations. Why are you working with capitalists who are only doing nature conservation because of hunting, and which are not even giving access to their land to have a look how nature looks like over there? Let's say that all started, I would say, 8 years ago. Me and Tilmann, we were both asked by the European Commission to come over, and they said, well, we have some money to invest in private land conservation. The condition is strictly that you're going to work together. So we were starting to work together, and we were writing a project. And in, I would say, the very last weeks of writing that project, let's say from the two sides, from the boards, we got a red light, because Eurosite and some of its members said, yeah, but wait, we are not going to work together with those landowners. And our board said, yeah, no, we are not going to work with those green and dark green organizations. And so in the end, only a single project was submitted and approved. And I can assure you, on our side, there was a lot of frustration about that. The Commission saw that and said, yeah, but wait, we are going to make some additional means available next year. And we will write in the text that we now are searching for a project with individual private landowners or their representatives. And so we got a second project on private land conservation. 4 years we have been working each on our sides. Let's say a few times we had contact, but not too much. And after 4 years, they delivered a report, we delivered our report, and the Commission and we ourselves, we came to the conclusion that 85% of the recommendations were identical. Very specific, the use of easements as the #1 question to the European Commission. Please give us a number of instruments all over Europe that we have something like this, because that's what we need. That's the moment that the Commission said, yeah, but wait, if you have 85% of those recommendations in common, why is it impossible to work together? And so we were called again to the Commission, and they said again, well, we have some money for private land conservation, but make sure that you are working together, because otherwise you are not going to get the money, neither the one nor the other. And so we said together, we wrote a project, ENPLC. The fact that we are having this meeting here proved that we were able to write that project. And I have to say, from both sides, we see that minds are changing. Let's say from private landowners, we see quite often an interest in working with nature conservation organizations. We also see on the side of nature conservation that there is a willingness to work without immediately buying land. And I have to say, it was said tomorrow that NABU was against hunting, but we have a number of nature reserves which are managed by NABU and where hunting is part of the conservation effort. It's not only about trust between nature conservation organizations and individual private landowners. It's also about trust between landowners and farmers. And I make a difference here. You have heard this morning, farmers can be landowners, and then most of the time the decision is made quite easily. That's not always the case. And then we see that on one side, within the Common Agricultural Policy, Europe has a number of subsidies which they are giving to farmers, not even thinking about the fact that there is a landowner. And sometimes we see a number of incentives today, which is looking at the private landowner because you want to realize something on the long term, and we are forgetting the farmer. Let's say one cannot do something without the other. It's something you do together. The landowner has to make sure that you are able to do things on the longer term, that the farmer, whether it's the landowner or the farmer who is not a landowner, is the person who is on the land actually doing things. So the two have to go hand in hand. And then a third one is, let's say, the trust between private landowners doing nature conservation and the community at large. And there we have, let's say, the element of financial losses. And I've heard this morning, where is that coming from? There are no financial losses if you do nature conservation on private land. Well, if I look at Belgian rates, agricultural land 120,000 euros per hectare, forested land 35,000 euros per hectare, and nature conservation land 15,000 euros per hectare. So if you move from agricultural land into nature conservation, you do have a financial loss. And maybe that is not a real loss if we look at the landscape level, but then you have a situation where an individual private landowner is giving money away and where the community is gaining the money on the other side. And that's a situation which on the longer term is not going to work, and that's the reason that, let's say, within the European Landowners Organization, we are very much interested and very much in favor of the payment for ecosystem services, because there you are able to put a certain balance. Thank you.
Thank you, Jurgen. That was quick. Again, I'll refrain from commenting, although you really gave me a few opportunities to do so. We have 2 minutes left for questions. I'm sorry. So I would like to open the floor now if there are questions, and I can see the hands are rising already. Let me start with the gentleman over here, because I don't think you've asked before, but I know you need a microphone to do so. The gentleman to the left, in front of the pillar. No, there's more. There's another one in front of the pillar.
Merci. Donc Thierry Dupeux, je voulais poser une question.
I wanted to ask you an urban question. I work in urban matters. Is area taxable? And is it PLUI existing or before? What about the regulatory existence of that tool? Because we could use it as an urbanist. So we need to be careful about that. We need some good advice. The second thing about this morning is what organizations exist that would be validating over time that the obligations have been met, and who will be sanctioning if the hedge is ripped out or whatever, something has to be done. So I think that pacifists need to have some kind of organization. But I have to know how you get organized to have things respected. Good. Well, given the 2 minutes, first of all, the ORE cannot block urban projects. But since it recognizes the rights of a third party, in the Conservatory of Natural Spaces, the department, the township, who are benefiting from the ORE. So when they're implementing an expropriation, for example, or preemption, a preempted sale, they can, it modifies the law. It changes the situation, so it obliges a negotiation with who was benefiting from the ORE. But this seems to be more difficult to implement because it requires a negotiation with the right holder. The second question about who can implement the obligations if they're not respected, that's the question. If you're an owner and your tenant doesn't pay the rent, what do? You go see a judge. Well, if the owner does not implement the commitments he committed to, you have to consult the judge, take it to the judge, and it's up to the judge to require the execution by nature of the obligation and not necessarily by damages. Thank you for your presentations, and thanks for having made things so clear. Mr. Sainteny as well. It wasn't that obvious to talk about taxation. I'd like to underline the perverse effect that can have, so that policy, shared common policy, should not be opposed to community taxation. So it's interesting to propose other solutions and to underline that importance, the importance of that. I'd like to thank Mr. Martin. Through his paternity certificate, he's presented his baptism as well, because he's still looking at the person who was behind the terms so difficult to use in the field. We were talking this morning about the difficulty in the birth of the ORE. So where did the term come from? What is hiding behind that term, and so forth? But now when you have to get people to digest that by elected officials, it also requires a bit of explanation. I'm just trying to think of maybe we can deal with the name of the tool differently. Maybe
I'm trying to give the word to people who have not spoken yet today.
Merci. Je pense que j'ai une question qui est commune à quelqu'un d'autre. Donc...
I have a question in common with someone else. Why was there no support from the government to talk about this? That's what we're here for. And the promotional Sainteny, you said there were significant effects of tax incentives, and you showed us a diagram that showed the hectares and the number, but are we able to talk about the efficacy? Because if you use that for tax optimization, is there an efficacy in terms of protecting biodiversity? Do we have any indications about that protection? About the first question, sorry to be a bit caricatural, but time is short. There is a French administrative culture which is not based on contract. It's a regulatory contract about laws that come from above and that go down below. So we're given a tool that starts from the bottom and that is building something up. So it's not a criticism, but the French administration has administrative services are not used to having tools that start from the bottom and that work their way up. When I was criticizing earlier the OFB to not use the tool, it's because precisely they have the cultural approach, the usual one, where we are the public power and we formulate the rules and that are imposed, and if you don't respect them, you have a fine. And so the idea that we are the ones that give private people and that we build something, they're not familiar with that. And so they weren't really committed in that attitude of promoting the tool. To respond to your question, indeed, I didn't show that in the presentation because I didn't want to get too technical, but in the US, they've started procedures both to say that conservationism had to encourage certain ecosystems that were in the policy, and the policy of the state involved that were priority. For example, in wetlands and so forth. And in addition to that was another verification to see if things are respected. And if they're not respected, the tax advantage has to be reimbursed, and plus there are significant penalties. As an example, we're not here to do policy, but if there's somebody being sued because he did a conservation easement, because he didn't respect some things, he did it for financial reasons. It's one of the many lawsuits, but we're talking about it a little bit less than the other lawsuits. You may know this, right? There's laughter. Okay. The last question, sir. I work for Michael Weber, who's in the Moselle. And I wanted to ask you whether you think that the legislative means would be the best means to reinforce the incentive, from the tax incentive, and to encourage, as you were saying, some public institutions to promote this tool. Do you think that if we imagine, for example, a proposal, do you see other angles which would make it possible to improve the tool? And another last thing, in the PGA text from 2013, after the diversity law, what were the? I think it was cut down a bit after the passage with the government about the ORE side. My recollection is that I was impressed by the Assembly about that draft project, but there are a lot of questions about the questions of OREs, and the purpose of which, what do you need for that tax incentive? So there's no money. So I suggested, and Gilles Martin is the father of the tool, and I am the father of Articles 62 and 73. And I said, there's at least one thing you can do, is give us the ability to the town to exempt tax, because but Bercy won't oppose it, and the government needs to produce a report. What I didn't know is that they were going to produce a report saying we could no longer do anything. Not only it's the right means, but it's even mandatory, because taxes need to comply to law and not to rules. So there are a lot of amendments or proposals that were rejected. There are also a lot of parliamentary questions, and it's interesting to look and observe at those questions come from different political convictions. There is a conviction about the tool, and I think we need to submit new amendments by putting forward the fact that the quality, the price to earnings quality is good. And given the budgetal thing we're in, we need to move towards measures to protect biodiversity that are cheaper than other measures. There is one fashion, which is to create a national park for each type of medium. I'm not convinced of that analysis being right in ecological science. We can protect wetlands and forests otherwise than creating a national forest, because that's the most expensive one. You have to hire people, you have to have a public agreement. And we can do more OREs and protect a bigger surface area with OREs than with national parks. Same thing, we could protect more with OREs than by real estate acquisition, which doesn't mean we can't buy real estate when it makes sense, once the budget comes back, if they come back. Merci beaucoup.
This is a very fascinating discussion. Thank you. And you can see by the continued interest that we are not done with all that we have to discuss, but we have to do it another time. I'm sure we'll find a way with the Fondation François Sommer, ELO, Eurosite to
Thank you very much, Tilmann.
continue that.
Donc nous abordons maintenant la conclusion. Je parle à la place de ma collègue.
We are now dealing with the conclusion of this workshop. I'm handing over to Mrs. Pappalardo, who's the president of our scientific committee, who's honoring us with her presentation, and she's going to summarize the day's proceedings. Thank you for your patience. In 10 minutes left for those of you who have no trains to take. I'll be very short. Good evening, everyone. I'm not the president. I'm not a scientist myself, but I'm very happy to make a conclusion of this workshop and this day's proceedings. And so this is my task. May be difficult, but pleasant, to conclude your day's work. Don't worry, as I was saying, The colloquium was very rich and very dense. The weekend is getting closer, I know, and for many people there are trains to be taken and miles to go before you sleep, so I'll be very short. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this, Mr. Loisy, the General Director of the Foundation, Laurent Combois, who just handed over, his Director pour Nature, Cécile, Michèle, et Arnaud Julien, project managers in Pôle Nature, who worked to making this day's proceedings as stimulating as possible. And I think that was definitely, you were stimulated. We're very happy in the foundation side to have been able to welcome in our walls, thanks for coming to see us, all of the partners of the European Project LIFE, the PLC, financial program, not only LIFE, but the European Commission, which is the ending this year. And this colloquium was marking the closure of this great European initiative, which lasted 4 years, and the Foundation is honored to have been a partner. And thanks to you all to have come to Paris. And even if you came remotely, there were more than 200 people enrolled on Zoom, legal experts, natural space organizers, researchers, civil servants, a very biodiverse players and people that participated in this day's proceeding, and I would like to thank you all. Your presence shows the relevance of this question brought forward by the Fondation François Sommer. So what can private partners do to protect the environment? Now, this question in this day's proceedings was an attempt to respond to that, and I'd like to go back to the mission of the Foundation, sharing knowledge, grouping private owners together in favor of environmental action, and trying to get ahead of time and to listen to researchers and experts and to think and agree on some points of view, try to get closer, and to share an integrated vision of conservation of nature. These are really the strong words about what we've been saying in our mission here. And 75% of the forests are private in France. Private owners must have the tools they need, like turnkey programs, to protect their territory in favor of nature next to public actors. Yes, you've heard this all day. We've just heard brilliant expressions around the round table. Real environmental obligations belong to the panel of tools. It's not the only tool, but this panel of tools which you need to envisage to reach this objective. And I'd like to thank you then, the moderators and the speakers and the round table and their organizations to have enabled us to work together, I hope, to better understand what the real environmental obligations are, what is the potential of those obligations, which is huge, as we were just saying, and if we were able to use them. So, thanks to the Ministry of Transition, because there been a lot of public organizations that weren't too motivated, thanks to the ecological transition movement and the different territory people who were with us, the European Commission as well, and the Federation of Conservatories of National Regional Parks in the Pyrenees, and NABU, and I hope I've forgotten no one in my thanks. They are very sincere. If I have forgotten someone, it's not on purpose. And please forgive me. As to me, I must recognize, by listening to Gilles Martin, I understand that I'm not the only one. I wasn't alone in this administration. I'm not the only one that doesn't know the OREs. I'm ashamed of it now that I've heard you all speaking and shown me why it's so important and so interesting. So for my part, I will remain of today's proceedings a few points that seemed the most salient to me. The first point that is fundamental with the OREs, the owners may act in the service of the environment. They can now give to the earth that is dear to them an environmental application, and which helps it to be long-lasting. They can act. That is the key word. They may, it's up to them to decide, and they may act. They're not being subjected to something. They may act for that objective in defending the environment that they decide to do so. It's an ideal tool when you think about everything that has been said one wonders why we don't use it more. The second important point are the real obligations vis-a-vis the environment reveal a change in approach and upset traditional laws, as it was said earlier, because private against public, owner against structure, association, descending or ascending, we know very well, especially in France, but probably not only in France. These are questions that come back time and again. There are oppositions we need to face up to every day. And OREs respond to that by escalating the will of private individuals towards the general interest. So they're encouraging cross-cutting approaches by associating a contract for private owners and public actors and NGOs. We said a lot that it wasn't the habit of the administration to go into this type of approach. It's not either the habit of associations. But here we have a tool, and with goodwill of both, of all concerned, and the will on the part of the private owners, we can succeed in a result. So we need to support it and to get the word out. And the third point, and I have four, the third point is the mechanism is virtuous, notably, and maybe especially because it's flexible in terms of obligations, the duration of contracts. The theme that we're working on adapts to just about all situations in the field, to diversity of the context, the local and territorial context, in a context, especially today, when we feel both too many standards, but also a real need for protection, and not necessarily through constraints, because you can't do that. Maybe do it that way. So real environmental obligations propose an original way of doing it that's both flexible and a framework that's adapted to need into initiatives from the field. That's, for me, that is really the strong point about the characteristics of these real environmental obligations. And then my fourth point is the weak point up until now, is that OREs are not well enough known. And that's a euphemism. That's why we had today's day's proceedings. And the number one objective was to get the word out. We hope that this new tool will be better identified, better understood, and it'll entice people into the fold, and we'll be able to use it to take off and better conserve nature in all of its forms, in all of its dimensions, especially in the territories. So that's the wish. It's a weak point, but it's what we're wishing. We are going to continue to get that word out. So I hope that the workshops today brought you some keys to better your understanding and how to initiate or deploy the implementations of OREs in your countries, regions, and territories, and your contexts, your respective contexts, because it's good to have understood. Now, you got to put them into practice. And as we were saying, Mr. Kaufmann, the founder of the Tour de Vala, and also a friend of François Sommer, the survival of medium depends on their integration into our daily lives. It's excluded to protect nature against man, but rather with man, and maybe for man. It's obvious that the only protection system that is sustainable is one that joins together the local population to the project. This is the objective of real environmental obligations, where the owner and managers of natural spaces think about real environmental obligations to reach that objective. And thus, thanks to all for your participation, and I hope your future action. Thank you.